I'm Rebecca Ritters. Welcome to the program. Russia is holding its annual celebration of its 1945 victory in World War II with a show of military might as its army battles Kiev's forces in Ukraine. You're seeing live pictures now of Moscow's Red Square, military vehicles at the Red Square for a major parade on the day Russia calls Victory Day. Russian President Vladimir Putin will be giving a speech shortly where the world will be listening closely to what he'll say about his war against Ukraine. Our DW reporter Aaron Tilden joins me here in the studio. Aaron, hi. V-Day has always been very significant for the Kremlin, a big day. Talk us about the significance of this particular V-Day.
Well, I mean, Victory Day plays a very special role in Russian politics in general. Since 1995, excuse me, it's really become kind of a touchstone of sorts, kind of a nationalistic holiday. It's almost like the default national holiday in Russia where they celebrate their victory over Nazi Germany. You have to remember, the Soviet Union and the Russian people suffered like hardly another group of people at the hands of the Nazis. They lost some 27 million Soviet citizens during the war, and much like in the United States or the UK or even Australia, it's kind of become a touchstone of sorts where they kind of look at that and say, look, we are the good guys. We beat in a demonstrably evil empire, and it's kind of become one of the founding mythos of modern Russia. Now, Putin...
But from my understanding, Putin has changed the narrative around V-Day.
Well, he's intensified it to a large extent. Basically, it's become one of those events where people rally around the flag, they look at the grandeur of the Russian state and the strength of the Russian state and through its military, looking at all the new weapons that they have and the forces that they have in general. Now, that brings us to today. I mean, all indications are that Putin wanted to declare victory in Ukraine at this Victory Day. I mean, that would just kind of lend itself based on his nationalistic policies. But he's very much on the back foot right now. He's not had the quick military victory that he really wanted in Ukraine. So this Victory Day is kind of being watched by observers around the world. How is Putin going to reframe this conflict to make it either look like he has that victory he's wanted, or maybe get his people ready for a long-term battle, like a battle of attrition that could go several months or several years? We don't know how he's going to take it this direction, which is part of the reason it's such a hotly watched event by Russian observers.
Well, I wanted to touch on that. There's been so much speculation about what Putin might say today or what he's going to do, which direction he'll take. What are you going to be looking out for? Well,
I'm really going to be looking out for that reframing. We don't know exactly how he's going to take this. Some analysts, a lot in the United States, are expecting him to actually declare total, complete war against Ukraine, because you have to remember, right now, this conflict we're seeing isn't officially a war. It's a special military operation. Now, if you were to declare war on Ukraine, official war in Ukraine, that would allow them to call up more reserves, to create a general mobilization in the country, and we could see an escalation of the conflict. At the same time, he might be going more the insurgency route, where he says, okay, look, this is going to be a long conflict. It's going to be kind of like a situation in the Balkans after the Soviet Union collapse. He could be looking at getting his people ready for a long conflict through the end of this year, through the winter. Or, you know, he could also attempt to threaten with that escalation in order to get Kiev to come to the negotiating table. We really don't know which way he's going to take it, which is why a lot of people are really waiting for that speech to see, you know, where Putin's going to pass the ball next.
Well, that speculation about declaration of war and potential mobilization of Russians, how do you think, if he were to take that route, how do you think that would go down with the Russian population?
Well, that's really an open question. I mean, if there is general conscriptions going on, if there's a general draft, if that goes down in Moscow and St. Petersburg, well, they're likely to go onto the streets and demonstrate against it. While Moscow and St. Petersburg, the major cities in the country, might seem like they'd be most loyal to Putin, they're actually, you know, kind of the hotbeds of opposition to Kremlin power. That being said, there isn't a lot of opposition in Russia in general. You'd probably be seeing a lot of that conscription out in some of the periphery, in the smaller towns, or out in Central Asia as well. That has also apparently been a strategy with getting some of the troops that have been sent to Ukraine anyway, so it's most likely to see that mobilization going outside of the country. But again, a lot of analysts are actually saying that Russia doesn't really have the capacity, they don't have the supply chains, they don't have the logistics to support that type of general mobilization. So that's also an open question if Russia would actually be able to declare proper war in Ukraine moving forward.
Well, in that case, do you think it could be likely that he might be looking for an exit or an off-ramp, if you will, that he might say, OK, we've taken Mariupol, we've got these minor successes here and there, and, we're happy with that, and thanks very much? Or, what's your opinion there?
Well, that could be one of the models moving forward. Some people are saying that he might actually declare that Russia has already achieved its goals in Ukraine, might actually say that, we've, quote unquote, taken the East, it's now secure. Of course, that doesn't gel with the facts on the ground, but it's all about, the portrayal. It's all about the framing moving forward. He could very well say, we've reached our goals and we're now ready to go to the negotiating table. But Vladimir Putin is a very, very proud man. And we don't know if he would actually be willing to take what would be seen internationally as such a major setback. He has proven himself to be very calculating, but also very thin-skinned in the past. So, yes, it is a possibility. I don't necessarily think it's a likely scenario, however.
You've spent a lot of time reporting in Russia and living in Russia, studying in Russia. You speak Russian. Do Russians support their president? Yes,
they do. I mean, all opinion polls have indicated that actually Putin's support in recent months has gone up thanks to the conflict in Ukraine. I'm from the United States originally, and at least in this aspect, the U.S. and Russia is very, very similar. When there's a war on, we rally around the flag. Russians aren't any different in that context. At the same time, you have to say Putin has really cemented his grip on power since 2011 when he came back into power. There isn't a functioning opposition in Russia. I mean, most of the opposition leaders have either been killed, poisoned, or put in prison. And a lot of the more liberal opposition figures have been forced out of the country. So take any of these opinion polls with not just a grain, but a kilogram of salt, because there isn't that climate in Russia that really allows you to voice your opposition, especially when somebody calls up on the phone and says, do you support the president? Most are going to say yes. So yes, there is an incredible amount of support for Putin, even given this war right now. But at the same time, there isn't that culture of dissent that would allow many Russians to really speak their mind.
Well, that brings us to how Putin's been selling this war to the people. A laundry list of false claims, many of which we're expecting to hear some version of again today. And I want to walk through some of them because they can really be seen as a window, you could say, into what Putin's thinking. So let's start with Putin's claim that Ukraine is or has been committing genocide against Russian speakers in its own country.
Well, if we're talking about in Ukraine, there's absolutely no evidence of that thus far. And this kind of ties in to something that Putin's been really supporting for years now. There are these whole concepts of Ruski Mir, or the Russian world, or Novaya Rossiya, New Russia. And basically, this has been attempted by the Kremlin to claim dominion over areas with our Russian-speaking people, basically saying the entire periphery around Russia is Russia's sphere of influence. So if you threaten Russians there, we have the right to intervene, either economically or militarily as well. It's a way of kind of trying to expand their power bases. And, it's an attempt to justify the conflict in Ukraine at this point, but there is no evidence that there's been massive motions taken against Russian speakers there. There has been no widespread violence against them, so it's a claim that just in the face of it is hard to back up with facts.
Yeah, I've spent a lot of time in Ukraine recently, and it surprised me that, everyone speaks both languages. It's really okay. Some people grow up speaking Ukrainian with their family and others Russian, but it's very much a two-language country, if you will.
That very much is. You have to remember, Ukrainians and Russians, they are the brother peoples. They've been talking about that for as long as history has existed. I mean, basically, modern Russia actually came out of a kingdom that was loyal to Kiev originally 1,000 years ago. So, I mean, there isn't really any evidence to indicate that there is any type of this genocide being committed against Russian speakers.
Right. Another of Putin's claims is that Russia is invading Ukraine to denazify it. We've heard that a lot. This has been widely debunked now, hasn't it? Can you explain a bit about that?
Oh, very much so. And this is a further attempt by the Kremlin to delegitimize the Ukrainian government, especially in the context of Victory Day. I mean, this is what I was talking about a little bit earlier. Like, the Nazis were the big bad in Russian history, right? They were that evil that was trying to destroy the Russian people. And by claiming that, modern Ukraine has some type of connection to that Nazi past, you're attempting to demonize and other the Ukrainian government, the Ukrainian people. And, on the face of it, they have a Jewish president. They have a Jewish president. I mean, a democratically elected Jewish president. It's really hard to gel that with the claim that there are Nazis secretly running the government. And I was actually out with a Jewish friend of mine from Kiev yesterday, and we were talking about this conflict right here. And he said, yes, growing up as a child, he did face some anti-Semitism on schools and at university, but it wasn't any type of government program. It was just that unfortunate baseline anti-Semitism that you find all over certain parts of Europe. At the same time, he said he noticed a massive change as he was growing up and getting older, that anti-Semitism started to disappear. And he said for him, the election of Volodymyr Zelensky was the ultimate sign that he, as a Jewish Ukrainian man, that he was a full-fledged member of society there. He said that was the symbol for him. So he completely, as do many people, just rejects the association and the accusation that there's some type of Nazi presence in Ukraine.
OK, let's now look at Putin's allegation that Russia isn't waging a war in Ukraine and it hasn't committed these war crimes that have been alleged against them.
Well, I mean, when it comes to the claim that there isn't a war going on in Ukraine, I mean, what else is it when there are bombs flying and bullets flying? I mean, just because they haven't officially declared war does not mean that there isn't an armed conflict going on. That's just an attempt to reframe this entire conflict as something that it isn't, and that is, you know, a military intervention. It is a full-fledged war. Now, when it comes to the war crimes, that is really counterfactual to the evidence we're seeing, like those horrible pictures that we all saw several weeks ago in Bucha. I mean, we're talking about civilians who were executed. I mean, that's hard to debate. We have seen mass graves.
And worse, tortured, raped. I mean, you know, we're really seeing a lot in that way. So, I mean, I think we also need to say that there have been accusations of war crimes on the other side as well. But I think the gravity or the weight definitely lies certainly more on the Russian side. Well,
I mean, when it comes to the accusations of war crimes, these do need to be investigated. But on the face of it, we have seen the evidence. We have seen dead civilians. We have seen the reports, as you were saying as well, of torture and rape. So they are definitely being committed. We know this is happening. And, you know, it's just counterfactual to claim anything otherwise.
Finally, Putin has claimed that Russia invaded Ukraine in order to defend itself from Kiev and the West in particular. What's the truth there? Well,
we so far have not seen any real evidence of any Western aggression against Russia. This again goes to the concepts I was talking about earlier, this Russian sphere of influence. Basically, I mean, you can debate about NATO expansion as much as you want, but the only type of aggression that Putin really seems to be worried about is new countries joining NATO. There has been no military aggression against the Russian Federation, well, since it's actually existed, I mean, since it was founded. Putin has always been concerned about NATO expansion, but at the end of the day, what he's attempting to do here is prevent a democratic, sovereign country from determining its own fate, basically saying, you're near my country, you're in my sphere of influence, I can determine your political future. And that's something that definitely runs counter to basically the international rule of law. And so, yeah, there is no evidence of Russian, or sorry, rather Western aggression against Russia. It's just, it is, again, counterfactual.
Well, Aaron, just before we move on and have a bit more a look at the live pictures, but Putin has asserted that Russia's military operation in Ukraine and Kiev is a success. What's the reality there?
Well, I think the reality is that Putin was surprised. They were surprised, Putin and his military were surprised by the tenacious defense that the Ukrainians have been able to put up. Basically, all indications are that he was expecting a quick victory. That was supposedly what his intelligence service also promised him, and that's not what we've seen. Yes, they're doing incredible damage to cities like Mariupol, but he was expecting to take Kiev quite quickly, and they have not been able to do that because, just like in Afghanistan, with both the Americans and the Soviet forces, you should never underestimate the ability of a country to defend itself if people are defending their homes and their own people. And that's what we've seen here. They put up an incredible resistance, the Ukrainians, I mean, against a superior military force. And it really seems like Russia and Putin were not prepared for this just, you know, skin of their teeth defense that we've been seeing the Ukrainian people put up.
All right. Thank you, Aaron Tilton. We'll be speaking to you much throughout this morning. Stay there. But now we're going to head over to Yuri Resheto, who's in Riga. He's covered the parade from Moscow for the last couple of years. Yuri, how different is this parade from previous years?
Well, this year's parade will not be the same as always. Less military equipment is expected this year than in parades before. What's also new is that for the first time, Rebecca, Russian paratroopers who are currently fighting in Ukraine are taking part in the parade.
Yuri, I'm going to just interrupt
international guests, the Russian leadership.
No, I'm sorry. Do continue, Yuri. We're just expecting to hear... No, we're going to go to President Vladimir Putin, who is speaking.
Comrades, soldiers, sergeants, and officers, generals, admirals. I'd like to congratulate you on Victory Day, where we defended our homeland at a time when our fate was at stake. We had patriotism, and we have attacked everywhere on the battlefield. We have fought the war in Moscow, Stalingrad, Kiev, Kursk, Sevastopol, and Kharkov. And we do the same now. Today, you're fighting for our people in the Donbas. You're fighting for the security of our homeland, Russia. The 9th of May, 1945, is part of our eternal history as a triumph of our united Soviet people. We were full of spirit, and we have won the war at the battlefield and at home. Everyone here has a member of the family that they remember, that have participated in the war. This is a day today where we are having the parade of the Immortal Regiment. They remember those people, their family members who fell in the battlefield, and they remember all the war veterans. We are proud of this generation of victors. We have the duty to remember everyone who won over fascism and made sure that the horror of a global war will not repeat itself again. And Russia has always stood up for an international system of equality, and it is a system that we need absolutely in our international community. Last year, we signed a treaty on security guarantee. We have always tried to find compromise solutions, and we like to have everyone's interest in mind. But this was all in vain, and it shows that other countries had completely different plans. This is what we are seeing today. They have tried to attack our historical territories, like the Crimea. They have threatened to use nuclear war, and the West has supported these military actions carried out in our neighborhood, and that is why it was a threat we couldn't accept. It was a threat directly at our border. Everything showed that we are dealing with banderovцы, we are dealing with Nazis, and we had to do something about it. Let me repeat, we have seen, like the military infrastructure developed. We have seen more and more international military advisors coming into the country. We have seen that the country was provided with modern weapons. There was a threat that was growing day by day, and we had to do something. We had to do it, and we did it. It was the only right solution we could take. It was a decision taken by a sovereign and strong country. The United States of America, especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union, have talked about their exclusive status. They have humiliated not only the whole world, but also their satellite states. And they have always done everything they wanted to do. But we are a different country. Russia has a different character. We are never going to say no to our traditions, to the love of our country, and we respect the culture of everyone. We have long traditions, and we have seen that they have tried to denigrate the memory of the Second World War. And they have never respected the heroism of our fellow countrymen. We know that the American veterans that wanted to come to the parade in Moscow could not come. They were banned from doing that. But we would like to say we are proud that they are our allies, that they have participated in the victory. We respect the Americans, the French, the British, that were always part of the war against fascism. We are also proud of the Chinese people who've done the same to win over fascism. Today, in the Donbas, the militia and our forces stand up in order to defend our territory. We have many people we should remember, and they are now supporting us in the Donbas. You are fighting for your homeland, for the future of our homeland. You are fighting for the memory of the Second World War never to be forgotten. We are going to punish the Nazis. And we would like to really make sure that we remember our sons, our daughters, our fathers, mothers, our grandfathers, our husbands, wives, brothers, sisters, family and friends. We also would like to respect those who fought with us in 2014. We are remembered the peaceful people in the Donbas who were killed by the Nazis. We also respect our soldiers who have given their lives in order to defend our homeland, Russia. Let's have a minute of silence in honor of all those. Dear comrades, the death of every soldier and officer of our country is, of course, a loss for everyone, for the families, for the state, the regions, the NGOs in our countries do everything they can to help everyone. We help especially the children of our wounded and dead soldiers. We have signed, as president of this country, a decree to help the soldiers and officers. I also would like to thank the medical personnel of the military hospitals for their dedication, for their work. I respect you because you're fighting for everyone's life, everyone who fights with all his or her might. Today, we stand at the Red Square. We stand together as soldiers, as officers, coming from all the regions of our big country. There are also those with us who have come right back from the Donbas, from the front line. We remember how the enemies of our country have tried to use international terrorism against us. They have tried to make our country weaker. They have tried to introduce terrorism and enmity, but it did not happen. Together we stand as different nationalities. We are brothers. We see ourselves as brothers. This is the strength of our united multinational state. Today, you defend all these things that your forefathers fought for. They always wanted to have a safe country, a safe home. And this is what we need to do. We are the successor generation. We have to defend our country, and we have have to make this country a safe one. Those who won a victory over fascism in the Second World War is a symbol for us forever. It's the generation of winners, and we are always going to compare to them. For Russia, for victory. Hooray.
Russian President Vladimir Putin giving a speech at the Victory Day celebrations in Russia, the annual event to mark the end of World War II and Russia's victory in that conflict. Aaron Tilton is back in the studio with me. Aaron, there's a lot to take in there. What were your main takeaways from what Putin had to say today?
Well, I found it really interesting how he again attempted to, delegitimize the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian government by connecting them illegitimately to some type of Nazi past, saying again that this is a direct connection to the Soviet Union's historical struggle against Nazism and Nazi Germany. I mean, as we were saying earlier, it's a completely baseless claim, but it's a way to demonize and other these people that they are struggling against, that were previously, one of the brother peoples in the Soviet Republic. At the same time, it was interesting to see the framing, basically saying that Russia is under attack, it's besieged on all sides. That's not true, of course, but that is what he's claiming against to his own people, saying that this is about the future of Russia and Russia's security, again, trying to put the onus, do a little bit of victim blaming and blame the Ukrainians and the Western powers for attacking Russia, when, of course, that just didn't happen. I also think there were some interesting dog whistles there for international viewers, international audiences. I mean, he did mention global war. He mentioned the prospect of a third world war, saying that's definitely not what Russia wants, but flip it around. That's kind of an indication, and I think a way to try to intimidate some of these Western observers, saying that is something that they are thinking about. Also, what just seemed another just kind of breathtaking claim to me was the accusation, rather, that Western powers first threatened to use nuclear weapons in this conflict. Now, of course, I
was really surprised by that too. I mean, that has been something that he's been saying for some time, but...
Yeah, it's almost a breathtaking claim, because at the end of the day, while people have said that it might come to the use of a Russian tactical nuke in this conflict, of course, I don't believe that's going to happen. I do not believe they're crazy enough to do that. By saying that it hasn't been Kremlin spokespeople and proxies who have been talking about that. It's just it's a new way to look at reality that just doesn't gel with the facts at all. We have been hearing that from Kremlin proxies for several weeks now. So a lot of breathtaking claims made there that just seem to be completely counterfactual to what we're seeing in the actual conflict in Ukraine right now.
Yeah, I mean, saying that we had to take action. We were being attacked. I mean, it's kind of unbelievable that you can go out and say something that clearly, we were just talking about it before, that's sort of complete falsehoods. We were under attack. There was no indication that they were under attack.
Absolutely not. But you have to realize that this Victory Day celebration, it seems like what he's attempting to do right now is really swear his people and get them in line and swear them on a long conflict. I mean, basically, what my takeaway from this is he's saying, look, we're in this for the long run. We're not going to declare a total war, but we're not backing down either. And this seems to be a real attempt to get the Russian people to toe that line. And, by flipping the dynamic around and saying, like, look, we are the ones who are under attack, he's really kind of playing into this whole media system that they've built up. You have to realize there is no real opposition media and there is no critical media in Russia. The TV channels all toe the Kremlin line. It's mostly Kremlin proxies who are showing up there anyway. Same thing with most of the newspapers as well. There isn't that free opposition media, which basically means he has the ability to basically dictate what reality is, at least what the public perception is. And that's what he's doing here. He's basically saying, this is is the line we're going to go with, and this is the line you're going to continue to feed to the Russian people. So for me, this is about swearing the Russian people in for a very, very long conflict, probably moving through the winter.
Will he succeed, do you think? Do you think he'll get the Russian people on board?
I do, to be absolutely honest. There is widespread support for Putin and for this conflict. While, of course, there are a lot of people questioning the legitimacy of it, at the same time, they're not doing that publicly, right? There isn't that open, free space for democratic public debate as you do have in Western countries. So, yes, I do think it will be successful. Now, if this really drags on, if this really becomes another Afghanistan for them, that could be a different situation. You might see some more protests there. I mean, when it comes to the body count, the Soviet Union lost 14,000 people over 10 years in Afghanistan, and by all indications, the Russian Federation, in just a couple of weeks of fighting, has already lost more than that. So as more people continue to come home in body bags and the costs continue to pile up, it could change.
Russian mothers, Russian wives, these, the people that are left behind are going to start...
They're definitely going to start noticing. And as this becomes a continued war of attrition, that might change the dynamic. But at least right now, it seems that Putin is basically saying to the Russian people, like, look, we have to fight this fight. This is going to be our eternal fight moving forward. He even said that at one point. This whole idea of the immortal regiment, this honoring the fallen of World War II. He's saying this is the same, that direct connection. This is our, once again, existential struggle against the West, against these supposed Nazi forces that don't actually exist. So it really seems like he's saying, look, this is a fight about the very existence of Russia, which, again, it goes into this dynamic of Russia being under assault, which is just not the case. But it seems like Putin is not willing to back down in the situation. He doesn't want to give an inch.
What about the sanctions? I mean, just briefly, the sanctions, there's been a lot of conjecture as to whether or not they'll be effective. Do you think Putin looked like a man that is going to be swayed by sanctions? And as they take hold, will people in Russia, do you think, turn against this special military operation?
Yeah, well, the sanctions are definitely having an effect. This is the worst round of sanctions. They've been under sanctions since 2014, but this is an incredible, a new level of sanctions where you're talking about oil embargoes against the country. And you have to remember 55% of the Russian budget is actually funded by the sale of hydrocarbons. So yes, these sanctions are having an incredible effect. At the same time, though, sanctions have never stopped an army. The only thing that stops an army is another army. So, the sanctions are hurting the Russian people and hurting Russian businesses. But no, I don't think it's going to turn the tide in the conflict. And also, Putin is not a man who respects sanctions. He respects power. And that is really the only thing that's going to be able to stop him.
Well, we want to turn to the military aspect now. Aaron, stay there. We'll come back to you shortly. But we're going to turn now to Oxford in the UK, where Frank Ledwidge is standing by. He's a former British military intelligence officer and an expert on military strategy. Frank, thanks for joining us. What are your reflections on Putin's speech?
Well, first of all, as Aaron hinted, or said straight out, there was an attempt to delegitimize Ukraine. I think the country was mentioned once at the start. I'm not even sure of that. It certainly didn't figure. The name of the country wasn't mentioned. Donbass, however, figured 5 or 6 times, which indicates, of course, the focus, therefore, now of Russian strategy. It was quite surprising to me that was foregrounded so much. So that's my initial reflection. And then, of course, there's that sort of read back into the Second World War and the length of the conflict that Aaron's already talked about, that this is going to be a long struggle, preparing people for kind of heavy casualties that, in fact, were already that were acknowledged. I find that quite interesting, too. Yeah, but no mention, of course, of mobilisation yet.
No, well, there was a lot of speculation there on whether the president would officially declare war in Ukraine. That didn't happen. There was moments there where I thought he may actually do that, but the language he pulled back. Were you surprised by what he said?
To that extent, yes, but only from a sort of analysis perspective. The Ukrainians were pretty confident last week. Their intelligence service was pretty confident that they were going to declare mobilization. And over the last couple of days, there have been various sources which have tended to indicate that was going to happen. And I didn't expect full mobilization because I think, as Aaron's already said and has been made clear over the last week or so, it's really difficult to do. They haven't really got the equipment for it. It's a bureaucratically an immense exercise and politically dangerous. But perhaps calling up of an early echelon of conscripts or something like that to reflect the importance of the war. But we didn't get that. Very interesting. But very interesting also because to some extent it's a failure of Western analysis. It's the first time that's happened during this war. The British were pretty certain that was going to happen until last week. The Americans were pulling back.
How did he use that speech to sell the special operation, as they call it, to the people there?
Yeah, simply seeing it right from the start as an extension of that war against the Banderovci, the Nazis, always reading back into that. We've already heard about the Immortal Regiment, and there's been some talk about that over the week, and a little bit of corruption around it. But anyway, because it was clearly going to be foregrounded. So yes, a continuation of that old struggle, time and time again, that drumbeat, plus constant mention of Donbass. That, to me, was very interesting, focusing that campaign down there.
All right, Frank, stay with us. We're going to come back to you in a moment,
Sure.
but we want to look at the military strategy of Russia now. As Russia commemorates its World War II victory, Western countries say it has nothing to celebrate in its invasion of Ukraine. The scale of Ukrainian resistance has confounded Russian commanders. Russia has made little progress in its invasion in recent days. The battlefield map shows Russian forces still holding an arc of territory across Ukraine's east and south, centred on that breakaway Donbass region. Russia has been forced to scale back its ambitions after retreating from areas surrounding Kyiv.
Capturing the capital, Kyiv, was one of Moscow's primary objectives when it launched its invasion of Ukraine back in February. But the level of resistance Russian forces encountered took many by surprise. By early April, tens of thousands of its soldiers had pulled back over the border into Russia and into neighbouring Belarus. Small towns like Makariv, west of the capital, have been left in ruins. Now, in the spring sunshine, a semblance of normality has returned, and daily life goes on now the Russians have retreated. But more disturbing evidence is emerging that Russian troops committed war crimes. Ukrainian prosecutors and rights groups say hundreds of civilians were abused and murdered.
Of course, the Russian government and the Russian militaries have committed awful crimes, war crimes, and for that they must be held to account.
Having failed to take Kyiv, Russia has stepped up its attacks in eastern Ukraine, focusing on the Donbass, the industrial region where separatists backed by Moscow have been fighting Ukrainian troops for 8 years. These pictures released by the Russian Defense Ministry show its heavy artillery firing at Ukrainian positions, with the front line constantly shifting. Ukraine's defense chief says a counter-offensive could soon begin to push Russian forces away from key cities. If that succeeds, it would be a further blow to Vladimir Putin's territorial ambitions and his hopes of taking over large areas of Ukraine.
Well, Frank Ledridge is still with us. Frank, where do you think Russia stands militarily 2.5 months into the war in Ukraine?
Well, military analysts or strategists look at 3 levels of war. You've got the tactical, which is the combat level. You have the operational, which is the sort of theatre level, that's to say the Donbass operation, or perhaps even the whole country. And then you've got strategic, which is the international dimension. So let's look first at the tactical. So right now, as of yesterday, the Russians have made some gains down in Donbass, very slow. They're bogged down. They haven't managed to exploit any breakthroughs. Yesterday, they did capture a town called Popasny, which they've been after for a long time, but otherwise not so much. North of that, around Kharkiv, Ukrainians are making major gains. They're pushing that Russian artillery back and Russian forces back away from there. But at the operational level, of course, what you've had is defeat in the north, which we've already heard mentioned. They're being held, obviously, in the south and east. And that's likely to remain the case, particularly because it's very clear that the war is not being ramped up as we expected. Finally, strategically, the grand strategic level, well, they're total disaster for the Russians. Look, the whole purpose was or one of the avowed purposes was to stop the advance of NATO. Now you've got 2 of the more formidable countries in Europe joining NATO, who were previously neutral. Certainly Finland will, and probably Sweden later this year, or perhaps next year. So all told, 2 out of 10.
You mentioned there about the huge losses that Russia is facing, but the Russian people haven't really heard that much about those defeats, about the losses that they've been. I mean, it was mentioned today, Putin did sort of touch on it in the speech. Is today really about boosting public morale, do you think?
Yes, I think so. It looks to me that they're trying to feed back into that stream of when I hesitate to say victimhood, but there's this constant drumbeat for decades, not 2 or 3 decades only, really, of the great patriotic war, and that's going to go on to sustain support. But also what was surprising in the speech, I was just reflecting, no mention there of Kherson, no mention of Mariupol, no mention of the south, no mention of defending Crimea, all focused on the Donbass. Very interesting, that.
On that, I mean, you mentioned that earlier, that they really focused on the Donbass, and they did. What do you think that signifies?
I think it signifies. I mean, this is first blush, but it seems to me that it's again playing back into the initial day one story, which was we're there to defend the Russian people who are being victimized. Of course, they weren't down there, and limiting perhaps the objectives and almost an acknowledgement that we're not going to achieve very much elsewhere. I mean, I expected, at least, I wouldn't have been surprised to hear that there were going to be some announcements of, if not annexation, then new republics or something. We didn't get that either. So I think it's a scaling back of the strategic objectives. It doesn't mean war's going to be shorter by any means. It just means that the declared objectives now have been limited.
Interesting. They did mention, though, that Russia has enough high-tech weaponry to fight this war. Western intelligence begs to differ on that. How do you see it?
Yeah. Well, since the start, there's been questions as to the stocks of Russian precision weapons. And only this morning, the British Defence Intelligence, who give a little briefing every day, it's a synthesis of what people have been working on over the last couple of weeks, and teams will write their own synthesis. So today it was about exactly that, Rebecca, as you hint. Mm-hmm. And what they're saying is that Russia's running short of these weapons, of precision-guided weapons, which is very bad news for them because the Ukrainians are being reinforced with them.
But the Russian Deputy Prime Minister today said Russia is developing new generation hypersonic missiles. And what do you make of that?
Well, we saw the deployment of Kinzhal missiles earlier in the conflict about 6 weeks ago. Quite curious, really. It's not immediately clear that there were successful deployments, but yeah, sure they are. The one on the parade was a relatively new ballistic missile. We've seen no other weapons, as far as I'm aware, that are new. But of course, every major country is developing new weapons all the time, and of course, especially the United States. Russia's not ahead in any field that I can think of, except possibly hypersonic missiles. The Americans are going to jump those by a generation in the next couple of years. So, yes, they are developing new weapons, but no, we shouldn't be too concerned about it at the moment.
Now, we spoke briefly about morale of the Russian people, but what about morale in the military? We've heard a lot in recent months about how low that is in the Russian military. Can you tell us a bit about that and how they'll continue to fight this potentially protracted war?
There are 3 components to fighting wars. There's the conceptual, which is the ideas. There's the material, which is the kit. And then there's a moral component, which is the morale, the professionalism, and so forth. And you need all of them to succeed. Now, over the last 2 months, and we're nearly way over 2 months now, Russians have sustained serious defeats. Now, no soldier on the ground is going to be unfamiliar with that. In fact, they'll be intimately familiar. And again, the assessment of Western intelligence, which is reasonably even-handed on this, is that the Russians have got real problems there. Units are being cycled in and out. At least the Ukrainians reported last week, and no one denied it, I think, that a whole division was pulled out of the line because they were mauled by the Ukrainians, again, down in the Donbass, where the advance was stalled. So morale is clearly not high. And in order to sustain morale, of course, you need to have a reason to fight and also some degree of success. And they're not seeing that at the moment. On the contrary, they're seeing if you're a soldier, you've been shoved around, you've lost a lot of comrades. The 60-second memorial, minute silence, of course, for every 1 second, 300 Russian soldiers have died so far, and a lot more are dying today. And no soldier on the front line is going to be unaware of this. However, what we ought to say is, of course, Ukrainians are taking casualties too. But the difference is they know what they're fighting for, and it looks as if they're prevailing. Very different situation.
All right, Frank, thanks very much for that. Military intelligence analyst Frank Ledwidge.
My pleasure, Rebecca.
Let's cross over now to DW correspondent Killian Byatt, who is in Riga. Killian, what was the most important message from Putin for you?
Well, I think the most important message is that he didn't actually call out a big mobilization of Russian reservists, or he didn't institute a draft either. This is what many people were expecting, especially as Russian forces took massive losses in Ukraine. Western military analysts estimate around 15,000. About 25% of Russia's battalion tactical groups. These are the smallest self-sufficient units in the Russian military, have been effectively made combat obsolete, really. So, yeah, Russia is running out of infantry. This is what the military analysts are saying, and this is why the operation in Donbass also seems to be going sluggish. It seems to be their last big push, so that's why many people were expecting a mobilization. But of course, for Putin, a mobilization would also be opening Pandora's box in essence. So Putin surprised us again by not doing what we thought he might.
Do you think that's an indication that Putin knows a mobilization may not be very popular at home?
Well, of course, a mobilization would be problematic, especially in the big cities in Moscow and St. Petersburg. What was definitely possible was a partial mobilization in the countryside, in the rural areas, where people would be more likely to go and fight. Yeah.
Okay, so today the spectacle, the parade and the speech by President Vladimir Putin seem to be aimed at fear-mongering as well. Do you think he succeeded there?
Well, Putin started out with Victory Day. Victory Day is one of the most important days in Russia. Having been in Russia extensively myself and talking to people, some people would even say it's more important than Christmas. It's definitely the most important non-religious holiday, and this is because, as Aaron said earlier, the Soviet Union took massive losses in the Second World War. 27 million Soviet citizens died. Just to put that in perspective, that's about 3 times the current population of Greece, or about 1/3 of the population of the UK. So the Great Patriotic War, as it is known in Russia, and the trauma that was instilled was kind of like the social glue that held the Soviet Union together. And this also is applicable to Russia as well, which came forth from the disintegration of the Soviet Union. But Putin took this memory of the Soviet Union that everybody can agree on, that was a massive trauma, and he hijacked it and framed it at really replacing what was Nazi Germany with Ukraine, saying the Ukrainians are fascists, are Nazis, and they are now the baddies. And this is, of course, absurd. It's been debunked. The Ukrainian government is not a Nazi government. Their president is of Jewish descent. But I think this is exactly what we expected to hear from him, and it's what he said.
How much did today's parade or did today's event differ from previous years? I mean, you mentioned, obviously, the introduction of Ukraine as a topic there, but, you know, how different was today compared to other years?
Well, one of the things that really stood out this year was that there were no foreign guests, not even President Lukashenko from Belarus, who is a close ally to Vladimir Putin. And the Victory Day is really being framed as a Russian victory when it was not. It was a Soviet victory. The Soviet Union was a multi-ethnic state with multiple republics. A big, heavy part of the fighting was actually in Ukraine, in Belarus, and of course also in the west of Russia. In the war, the Ukrainians also had a massive sacrifice. Kazakhs, the Buryats, really all people of the Soviet Union. And this year it was framed to be, a Russian victory.
Kilian, why do you think it is that Belarus's Lukashenko wasn't there today? That is quite surprising, isn't it?
I don't know exactly. I think I can't look into the mind of Putin, but I think he really wanted to focus on Russia, on this Russian war in Ukraine as well, and to kind of twist the narrative and the memory of this of the Second World War and the commemoration really of the losses that every family took, the sacrifices that were given by every family, and apply that to Ukraine.
Now, I feel like I may know the answer to this question, but I'm gonna gauge your answer anyway. How is this invasion, the war in Ukraine, being viewed where you are in Riga?
Well, I think most people here are horrified, especially the ethnic Latvians are horrified. It's a bit more difficult to say exactly how the Russian population sees it. About 1/4 of the Latvian population is of Russian descent or Russian speaking. When you walk through Riga, you really see Ukrainian flags on every building. On every single building, it looks like a Ukrainian embassy. But a few weeks ago, we were in Daugavpils, which is in the east of the country. In this town, it's the second largest city in Latvia. Russians are in the majority, and you don't see any Ukrainian flags really, and that difference really stood out. So I would say the country is a bit divided here.
All right, DW correspondent Kilian Bayer speaking to us from Riga. Thanks very much for that.
Thank you.
Well, let's turn to Ukraine now, where DW correspondent Fanny Fashar is standing by for us in the capital, Kyiv. Fanny, Russian forces have been under pressure to give Putin something he can celebrate for Russia's Victory Day, something he can take back to the Russian people. How do you gauge the speech? What do you think that might have been today?
You really wonder what that will be or has been already, because if you look at all these airstrikes across Ukraine over the weekend, so many arbitrary attacks, you really wonder, it cannot be that simply bombing a school, for example, in Luhansk, in Bolihorivka, that small village there in the Luhansk region, that this is something that they want to present as a victory. These are civilians, about 90 of them estimated have been sheltering in this school, so they've been already through a lot trying to look for some safety in a region that's heavily shelled for weeks now, and it appears that 60 of those 90 people have been killed. 30 of them came out of the rubble, and you really wonder just how could they even make it out alive there if you look at the pictures. So it's really unclear just what kind of victory and over what Russia wants to present as they are gathering there at the Red Square in a jubilant atmosphere. And as we have heard our colleague evaluating there, they're changing the narrative. This day, May 9th, actually stands for the Soviet Union's victory over Nazi Germany in World War II, but the narrative is really changed around there to present the form of victory over what Russia calls is Nazi Ukraine.
Well, he certainly didn't seem to have the glory prize that he may have hoped for today on Victory Day. Now, Fanny, if we move to the conflict as it stands, the fight for the East rages on. What's the latest from the front lines there?
It's very difficult to establish a picture due to lack of independent information and sources there, but certainly, especially today, there is a focus on Mariupol, that town that's been in the focus now for a while, because you have to know about 100,000 people are still in that town, and apparently they can only leave their homes if they have permission from the Russians, because the Russians control most of this town except for that Azov steel plant. So really the question is just whether that heavy shelling that we've been seeing play out over the course of the war already in Mariupol, whether that's going to be intensifying around and in that plant, Azov steel plant. Now the soldiers inside, the active soldiers inside, they say they're not going to disarm. They're going to defend this plant, which is basically the last holdout, Ukrainian holdout in Mariupol. What also, they're calling on humanitarian assistance here to take the wounded soldiers out. It's a very emotionally charged day today, May 9th, as it's unclear and so unpredictable what the Russian playbook looks like when it comes to further attacks today on Ukraine.
Now, Fanny, there's a lot of talk about referendums, new referendums in areas in the Donbass and Kherson. Can you tell us anything about that and the legitimacy of those?
If we look back on history, Crimea was annexed in 2014. Also there was a referendum that observers called a sham referendum, basically. And it looks like that this is going to be sort of the playbook there, also for places like Kherson, for example, which is also a key portal town in the south. We have to look at these key portal towns because they are like the economic vein of Ukraine. If you advance here, you basically control parts of Ukraine, important parts of Ukraine. And in Kherson, for example, they want to introduce the ruble a transition phase has already started a couple of days ago. So yes, as soon as you have referendums, you can of course then say the people wanted the Russian control, even though those referendums of course are happening under very different circumstances, because if you ask the people of a certain town, according to the Ukrainian constitution, you have to actually ask all people of Ukraine and not just certain citizens of parts of Ukraine.
Funny, you're in Kyiv, the capital. Authorities have been warning residents in the capital to brace for more airstrikes, particularly over this time, this Victory Day time. How is it at the moment in Kyiv?
It's definitely more tense compared to previous weeks, and also the time we've spent here building up to the day when on February 24th the war began. You really feel like something else is on the air, and in fact the advisor to the Interior Ministry just warned again today, repeating the warnings already we have heard over the course of the weekend by President Zelensky, that people should take those air raid sirens seriously, look for shelter, do not ignore them, because unfortunately, in fact, that was the case by so many people here on the ground as they seemingly become accustomed to these daily threats and in a way try to go about their daily lives. But when it comes to today, and as I say, it's a very emotionally charged day, everyone in Ukraine is on high alert. What is going to happen? What kind of airstrikes and where? So people are more cautious and are on alert.
All right, Fanny, thank you very much for that update. DW correspondent Fanny Fashar in Kyiv for us.